Wait, did Nintendo just tease the Zelda Ocarina of Time remake for Nintendo Switch 2? Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today I would like to have a discussion on this now new possible hint for a big remake for The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time for Nintendo Switch 2. If you've been following me for a while, you've likely heard some of my theories on this potential remake, but even more recently, a rumor has come out from an apparently credible place that's supporting this idea even more so with some extra details. And so I've been thinking about this lately, looking at some old Zelda interviews, trying to see if I can cobble together some sort of connection here that could give us a better understanding of what may be going on with this potential remake. And now, just recently, it seems like Nintendo's put something else out there that could be further fueling this theory I've had about this remake. So I feel like we have enough today to have a very interesting discussion of what might be going on with this potential epic release. But before going forward, let me point out I'm aiming for a goal of 60,000 subscribers. So if you find yourself enjoying my content, your subscription would be appreciated. Now this first little bit here isn't necessarily related to this potential Zelda remake, but it is an interesting Zelda rumor that I think is worth touching on here. Here on Twitter from Screen Time it reads, the live-action Legend of Zelda movie has reportedly begun casting for the roles of Zelda and Link. The studio is looking for actors between ages 16 through 23 via Daniel RPK. Daniel RPK posts these things on Patreon, which is why I'm reading it here instead. But basically, this person had also put out a story about there being considerations for Hunter Schafer to play the role of Princess Zelda. And there's been some conflicting reports on that story, and we've seen Daniel RPK not get everything right, so we're not entirely sure what's going on. But what's been understood, assuming these reports are to be true, is that Hunter Schafer's agent is pushing for them to be considered. That doesn't mean they've received the role, and now we're getting this new story from Daniel RPK that casting has just begun, that they're now looking actively for Zelda and Link, so it doesn't look like a decision has been made yet, assuming all these reports are true. And they're looking for actors between the ages of 16 through 23, meaning we're not going to be seeing young Link or young Princess Zelda like in Ocarina of Time or Wind Waker, for example. Now, personally, I think this is the right direction to go. I think they should be choosing actors that are close to their physical primes, actual adults, but young adults, so they can still be casted for years if they want to do like a series. And if they do want to pull in from some of the child Link stuff, then they can cast someone else to play young Link for some occasional flashbacks. But the main actors, I do agree, should be between the ages of 16 through 23. So let's say rumor, take it with a grain of salt. Daniel RPK does not get everything right, but I do think this one particular report here does make sense. But now on to the main topic of discussion here. This Zelda remake, an Ocarina of Time remake for Nintendo Switch 2 for the 40th anniversary has been my theory, which would be next year, which curiously lines up to be just right before the release of the live-action Zelda movie. So throughout 2026, they could have 40th anniversary celebrations, which may also include advertising the movie with actual trailers and stuff. But the basic idea behind this remake, to summarize it here, because there's really a lot that we've talked about over the last year or so, is that Nintendo will need some sort of ambitious new effort for 3D Zelda early on for their generation. But given that they just finished a full-on mainline 3D Zelda in Tears of the Kingdom just a couple years ago, they're likely very far off from having the next big brand new Zelda game. And so how can they get out a fairly ambitious project for Zelda to bring in that 3D Zelda fanbase somewhat early on to the generation? A remake. And Nintendo's already gone through all the different 3D Zeldas already and remastered them in some way. At this point, they have to do something a bit bigger. And we've seen a history of the producer of Zelda, Eiji Aonuma, tease future Zelda projects. He's even confirmed that he's teased some of these projects before, such as Link's Awakening Remake, Echoes of Wisdom, Skyward Sword HD, Majora's Mask 3D, there's more. But the point is, it's well documented that he has been known to tease future Zelda projects, and there are two different interviews where it looks like Aonuma was teasing something having to do with Ocarina of Time in the future. One where he's point blank asked by Game Informer if they are working on a modern Ocarina of Time remake, to which he laughed in English and said no comment, which is something he only normally does when he's teasing something. And then another time for the Nintendo Dream magazine, he was making remarks on how he doesn't think too many people know about Rauru from Ocarina of Time, the character. And so there was a weird emphasis placed on that. But then also, we have seen some interesting choices Nintendo has made with their merchandising regarding The Legend of Zelda. For example, with the somewhat recent release of the Zelda Lego set, the Deku Tree, it not only includes the Deku Tree from Breath of the Wild, which makes sense, the most modern version of the Deku Tree, but also from Ocarina of Time. And on top of that, quite arguably, there are more references to the Hero of Time in Echoes of Wisdom than any other reference to any other Zelda games. And quite recently, we've gotten an update on a rumor from Nash Weedle, who has been getting a lot of things right lately when it comes to Nintendo Switch 2. Mouse controls for Metroid Prime 4, 3D Donkey Kong as well as the 3D Mario in the Nintendo Direct, a free update for a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of No Man's Sky, the leaked Assassin's Creed Shadows for Switch 2, the tarnished edition of Elden Ring for Switch 2, and there's more. Point is, lately they've been getting a lot of very precise, specific things correct about Switch 2, and so it suggests that they do have pretty good information on what's going on behind the scenes, and they have talked about, more than once, this Ocarina of Time remake, and we talked about it not so long ago that there was a podcast I took part of with friend of the channel, Attack the Backlog, where they talked about this remake and how about a year and a half or so ago, they actually went through an art style redesign. And we're going to touch on that element in a moment here, but the main point is that there's even more little things coming out that seem to be supporting this idea that they are indeed working on some kind of remake here. And so today, or at least I saw it today, on the Nintendo Today app, Nintendo put out a new segment for The Legend of Zelda. The Legend of Zelda, World of Zelda, and they focus on the sages from Ocarina of Time. And so as you see here, we see Rauru, Nabooru, Impa, and they are talking about these characters from Ocarina of Time. And I've been looking through the Nintendo Today app and trying to see if maybe there's a little bit of more of a common thing to talk about prior games. And there is a little bit of them talking about some different Nintendo IP, not necessarily tying to a new game that's about to come out. Like, they have done some stuff for Metroid, for example, but Metroid Prime 4 is coming out this year, so it does make sense to push Metroid. But here, they have this whole Ocarina of Time thing that they're pushing here, which seems like a very curious choice. And so I then asked myself, is this a subtle hint towards the Ocarina of Time remake? Is the plan to sort of remind everyone or introduce these characters to a new audience here? I think it should be pointed out as well that they did put out a lot of cool Zelda stuff to start the Switch 2 generation. Nothing super substantial, but a lot of little neat minor things, like a Switch 2 edition for Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. And on the GameCube app, we have the Wind Waker. But also on the GameCube app, we have Soul Calibur 2, which has Adult Link from Ocarina of Time. And so some people have looked at it as maybe perhaps another way to subtly reference this particular version of Zelda. And so all those little Zelda things to start the Switch 2 generation, I think that's kind of like the Zelda stuff to carry us over until next year, essentially, where they can go bigger for the 40th anniversary. But you know, there's something else that I kind of consider here as well, especially when thinking about the sages, because I was theorizing this a little while ago with Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, but now that we're seeing that they're talking about Ocarina of Time and the Nintendo Today app, specifically focusing on these sages here, I'm now going back to what I was thinking about when it comes to Age of Imprisonment. So with Age of Imprisonment, it's coming out this winter. We don't know if that means at the end of this year or early next year, but at some point this winter, right? But this story is about the imprisoning war that happened well before any of the events of Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, where they were supposedly the original sages, including Rauru. And so I've wondered if Age of Imprisonment is going to play a role in expanding the lore of the sages here. And it's not just about learning more about Rauru from Tears of the Kingdom in his past, which alone I do find interesting considering the interview about Rauru from Ocarina of Time as well, but also we know we're going to be learning about the original sages that had their masks in Tears of the Kingdom. In the flashbacks, we didn't really get to know these characters. We're going to get to learn more about these characters in Age of Imprisonment. And so with this focus on sages, and now we're also seeing this story on the Nintendo Today app about these sages from Ocarina of Time, I feel like I'm seeing some connections here. Nintendo may want to build up a little bit of the story of the sages going to Age of Imprisonment, which would then in turn go into the release of the Zelda remake if this is indeed going to be happening during the 40th anniversary year or not too long afterwards. And so I was already keeping my eyes peeled for something having to do with the sages with just Age of Imprisonment, but now we're seeing something having to do with the sages with this recent Nintendo Today update focusing on specifically Ocarina of Time and not other Zelda games, when they don't really talk about other Zelda games but the modern releases. But now I would like to circle back to this rumor about the Ocarina of Time remake supposedly getting some sort of visual redesign not too long ago, about a year and a half or so ago according to Nash Weedle. If something like this is happening, to me it is suggestive that they're going to be a bit more ambitious with this project. It's not just going to be the remaster, it's going to be something even bigger, perhaps more so leaning in the reimagining direction, which might mean also it'll take a little bit more time. But if Nintendo is truly looking for something to come out close to the 40th anniversary and also the release of a live-action Zelda movie that is also going to bring in a significant portion of the 3D Zelda fan base, they might need something fairly ambitious here. They might want something that's going to showcase the abilities of the console. This is something we've seen Nintendo do before. And so I've been really lingering on this idea of this visual redesign. What might it fully mean here? And so I took a look at some prior interviews having to do with Ocarina of Time and also Ocarina of Time 3D. And I just found some things that I think are worth having a little bit more discussion on here. Here's an Iwata Asks interview with the Ocarina of Time 3DS development team. Iwata, why do you at Grizzle think that of all the games out there, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was so special? Ishii, it is the representative polygon 3D game. I feel like it is a title in which energy and a challenging spirit exploded in a way that said, this is what can be done. As a series goes along, rules usually appear, but with The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, there were no rules to making it. Iwata, it is true that the Nintendo 64 version of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time came along when video games were changing from 2D to 3D. Since the old 2D rules weren't applicable, everything was made from scratch. Everyone was groping their way forward in the dark, but for some reason there is an odd confidence and faith that they would definitely make it out into the light, and that spirit possessed the whole thing. And so this insight into the perspectives of Ocarina of Time I find to be illuminating. It kind of goes to show that back when they originally made Ocarina of Time, there was a lot to figure out still between 2D and 3D. How they initially designed the game is probably not how they would design it now today. I mean, they had to make a lot of changes with the Ocarina of Time 3DS version, for example. So going to this other interview between Miyamoto and Iwata in regards to Ocarina of Time 3D, we became able to cut the signs, but then we knew people would cut them in different directions. When I said that the signs should cut diagonally when Link swings diagonally, everyone froze up and said, we can't check exactly where they cut it. Iwata, you want the signs to cut exactly where you struck them? Miyamoto, even with the Nintendo 64 system, that would be impossible, so I said, no, we just have to make several different cut patterns. Iwata, then you made it cut into 6 pieces like a wheel of cheese. Miyamoto, right. Then you could cut the signs from different directions, but then when a piece flew off and it landed in the pond, since we hadn't taken care of collision detection when it hit against the water, it would just fall to the bottom with a clack. Iwata, it would be weird if it clacked against water. Miyamoto, generally, you would just decide not to put a sign by the water, but Morita-san made it so the piece would float on the water. Iwata, and it drifts away. And I think that's enough for this particular segment here. I just pointed out because here they're reminiscing on the development of Ocarina of Time for the Nintendo 64 on how there were challenges. And so when thinking about remaking Ocarina of Time for the Nintendo Switch 2, a console that's vastly more powerful, where we've made so many substantial leaps, and Zelda has evolved significantly considering what we've seen with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, that now that we have the open air format, even looking at Echoes of Wisdom, that introduced some of those elements as well, while retaining some of that classic Zelda feel, a little bit more of a hybrid. When considering what they might do for Ocarina of Time, how it may be more ambitious, how they're going through potentially an art style redesign here according to the rumor from Nash Weedle, we could be looking at something a fair bit more ambitious here. They already did the whole 3DS remaster thing. It was an ambitious remaster, but if they are going to be doing this game again, I think they have to go the extra mile here. It's not just going to be an HD upscale. This is going to feel like a proper new Zelda game for a lot of people. Perhaps not as expensive as like a Breath of the Wild or a Tears of the Kingdom, because that would somewhat defeat the purpose as a stopgap before the next new Zelda years from now. but it is seeming like a major significant effort here. If we are to buy into the rumor from Nash Weedle, this is being made by internal Nintendo. This is not something being outsourced by a smaller team to just upscale and improve the textures for Ocarina of Time 3D. This is an ambitious Zelda effort. And something else has been on my mind about this game and how they may be going through an art style change here. What is that going to entail exactly? Like, what are they changing with the art style? What led to the change? And that's obviously hard to say because what evidence do we have? Like, we don't know. But I did go back to this interview from 1999 with Shigeru Miyamoto, who talked about the development of Ocarina of Time, and I just thought this one little segment here was interesting in regards to this consideration I have about why they might have changed the art style. And the characters now have a very different vibe from the cute, cartoonish characters you originally drew, Miyamoto. Regarding the characters, in the beginning of Ocarina of Time's development, there was only adult Link with a harder, more intense look to him, but I insisted that they add a child version of Link too. In that sense, the Ocarina development actually moved closer to my original image of the character as time went on compared to the start. And here we see some concept art of young Link or child Link from the development of Ocarina of Time. And so I find this interesting because Miyamoto's talking about how the initial vision of Link, adult Link in Ocarina of Time, is that one, he was going to be the sole Link in the game. It wasn't just going to be two different versions of Link, but this Link was going to be a harder, more intense looking Link. And so that vision changed throughout the development of the game. What we got is something substantially different. I wouldn't call it realistic, but it's also definitely not like Mario either. It has its own unique style, and considering how they did improve on some things with the 3DS remaster, what might they change for a Switch 2 version of the game? And I wonder, is it possible that the reason why they went through a visual redesign of the game, apparently, is because initially they were planning on this being a Switch 1 project, but they transitioned over to Switch 2 and realized they had more potential to put something even better together here. Maybe the reason why they had a particular art style in mind initially was because that's what they thought they were capable of putting together successfully for Switch 1. But as the specs for Switch 2 became more clear and the circumstances became more obvious in terms of where they needed to go, they realized that they could do more with this project on Switch 2. And that idea excites me, it gets me wondering, what are they trying to achieve with this apparent remake for Switch 2? Probably something really cool and exceptional. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.